Imagine it's Friday, February 13th, 1970. You walk into your local record store looking for the latest Beatles album, maybe something new from Led Zeppelin or Creedence Clearwater Revival. Instead, sitting on the shelf is an album unlike anything you've ever seen. A mysterious woman dressed in black stands outside an old watermill. The band's name is Black Sabbath. The album is called Black Sabbath. You've never heard of them. Nobody has. You take it home out of curiosity. You drop the needle onto the record. Church bells begin ringing. Rain starts falling. Thunder crashes through your speakers. Then, a guitar plays three notes that sound genuinely unsettling. Not blues, not psychedelic rock, not hard rock, something darker, something heavier. By the time the first minute of that song ends, rock music has changed forever. Today we're looking at the 5 songs that didn't just make Black Sabbath famous. They invented heavy metal. We'll go inside the recording sessions, the myths, the accidents, the arguments, and the unbelievable twists of fate that turned 4 working-class kids from Birmingham, England, into one of the most influential bands in music history. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because every week we dive into the stories behind the songs that shaped generations. Now here's a question to think about. If Black Sabbath had never existed, would heavy metal still have happened? Or did history need these 4 particular musicians at exactly the right moment? Let's find out. To understand Black Sabbath, you first have to understand Birmingham. Most documentaries show you castles, the Beatles walking through Liverpool, or swinging London in the 1960s. Birmingham was none of those things. It was factories, steel mills, machine shops, smoke, noise, long shifts. Everything seemed covered in soot. This wasn't a city that inspired sunshine and flower power. It inspired survival. Tony Iommi worked in a sheet metal factory. Geezer Butler worked in accounting before taking factory jobs. Bill Ward worked wherever he could. Ozzy Osbourne bounced between construction work, plumbing apprenticeships, factory jobs, and even spent time in jail after a failed burglary as a teenager. None of them expected music to become a career. Music was simply the escape. Now imagine hearing machinery pounding 12 hours a day. Steel presses, grinding equipment, massive industrial hammers. That wasn't just background noise. It became part of their musical vocabulary. Years later, many people would describe Black Sabbath as sounding like factories making music. The band never set out to invent heavy metal. They simply wrote music that reflected the world they actually lived in. That's a very different thing. Now let me ask you something. Do you think where an artist grows up changes the music they create? Or would Black Sabbath have sounded exactly the same if they'd grown up on sunny beaches in California? It's an interesting thought, because environment shapes artists more than we often realize. Then fate stepped in and almost ended everything before it ever began. Tony Iommi was just 17 years old. He had already decided he wanted to become a professional guitarist, but his mother insisted he keep working until music actually paid the bills. On what was supposed to be his final day at the sheet metal factory, an accident changed rock history forever. A machine crushed the ends of the middle and ring fingers on his right hand. For a right-handed person, that might not sound catastrophic. Tony was left-handed. Those were his fretting fingers. Doctors essentially told him he'd probably never play guitar the way he had before. Imagine hearing that. You're 17, you found the one thing you truly love, and someone tells you it's over. Would you have quit? Most people probably would. Tony nearly did. Then the factory foreman tried to encourage him. He told Tony about another guitarist named Django Reinhardt. Django had suffered devastating injuries to his hand and somehow reinvented his technique. If Django could do it, maybe Tony could too. That story changed everything. Tony began making homemade fingertips by melting plastic bottles and shaping them into caps that fit over his injured fingers. He glued pieces of leather onto them to help grip the strings. But there was another problem. The strings hurt too much, so Tony started loosening them, eventually tuning the guitar lower. The lower tuning reduced the tension. It also created a darker, heavier, more ominous sound. Think about that for a second. One of the defining sounds of heavy metal may never have existed without a factory accident. Now here's where myths begin. You'll often hear people say Tony Iommi invented heavy metal because he lost his fingertips. That's only part of the story. The injury changed his guitar playing. But Black Sabbath became Black Sabbath because 4 completely different personalities came together. Tony created the riffs. Geezer Butler filled those riffs with dark, thoughtful lyrics. Bill Ward brought an unusual jazz influence that made the songs swing in unexpected ways. And Ozzy had one of the most distinctive voices in rock history. His voice wasn't polished. It wasn't technically perfect. It sounded haunted, lonely, almost vulnerable. That's exactly what those songs needed. If any one of those four people had been replaced, Black Sabbath probably wouldn't have sounded like Black Sabbath. Originally, the band wasn't even called Black Sabbath. They went through several names. One of them was Earth. Not exactly intimidating. The problem was another band already had that name, so they needed something different. The inspiration came from an old movie theater across the street from their rehearsal space. One evening, Geezer Butler noticed people lining up to see a horror film called Black Sabbath, starring Boris Karloff. He turned to Ozzy and asked something simple. If people pay money to be frightened by movies, why wouldn't they pay to be frightened by music? It's one of those moments that seems obvious now. At the time, nobody was thinking that way. Most rock bands wanted audiences dancing, or falling in love, or protesting. Black Sabbath wanted to create atmosphere, fear, mystery, suspense, not because they worshipped evil, because horror stories fascinated people. That's an important distinction. One of the biggest myths surrounding Black Sabbath is that they were a satanic band. The reality is much more interesting. Geezer Butler had read books on the occult. He enjoyed horror novels. The band loved horror films, but many of their songs were actually warnings, songs about temptation, greed, war, fear, the consequences of evil, not celebrations of it. There's a huge difference. Unfortunately, that difference often disappeared in newspaper headlines. Critics loved calling them satanic. It sold papers. Even today, people who have never actually listened to Black Sabbath sometimes believe the myth. The irony is almost funny. One of the band's earliest songs is literally about encountering evil and wanting nothing to do with it. That brings us to the song that started everything, Black Sabbath. Imagine walking into the studio, knowing nobody had ever heard anything quite like what you were about to record. The band entered Regent Sound Studios in London in October 1969. The entire album was recorded incredibly quickly. Accounts differ slightly depending on who's telling the story, but the recording took only about a day, with a few additional overdubs afterward. That wasn't because they were rushing, it was because they'd already spent months playing these songs live in clubs. The performances were tight, raw, ready. There wasn't a huge recording budget. There wasn't endless studio time. There wasn't pressure to create a masterpiece. Nobody expected this unknown band to change music. The opening wasn't accidental. Rain, thunder, church bells, then Tony's guitar. Those first notes use an interval historically nicknamed the Devil's Interval, or the tritone. For centuries, musicians considered it one of the most unstable sounds in Western music. Whether or not the old legends surrounding it are completely accurate, one thing is certain. It creates tension almost immediately. Now imagine hearing that in 1970. Most rock records opened with drums, a guitar riff, or a catchy vocal. Black Sabbath opened with something that sounded like the beginning of a horror movie. Then Ozzy begins singing, "What is this that stands before me?" It's not shouted, it's not screamed, it's almost whispered. The listener becomes part of the nightmare. And that's the brilliance of the song. It doesn't simply tell a scary story, it pulls you inside one. And that's the brilliance of the song. It doesn't simply tell a scary story, it pulls you inside one. As the song unfolds, Tony Iommi's guitar never rushes. Geezer Butler's bass moves like something crawling beneath the surface. Bill Ward refuses to play a straightforward rock beat. Instead, he constantly shifts the feel, giving the music an uneasy pulse. And Ozzy sounds less like a rock singer and more like someone witnessing something terrifying. That's what separated Black Sabbath from everyone else. They weren't trying to sound evil, they were trying to sound afraid. That's a completely different emotion. Now think about this. If someone walked into the room while Black Sabbath was playing for the first time in 1970, they probably wouldn't have called it heavy metal. That term didn't really exist yet. They might have called it frightening, weird, dark, even disturbing. Sometimes history doesn't recognize a revolution until years later. And this was one of those moments. The album was released on Friday, February 13, 1970. Whether that date was intentional or simply coincidence, has been debated over the years, but it certainly didn't hurt the band's mysterious image. Critics, however, were ruthless. Some dismissed the album as noisy, repetitive, and unimaginative. One review described it as little more than a musical equivalent of a horror movie. Ironically, that's exactly what the band had been trying to create. Fans heard something completely different. Young listeners who had grown up with blues rock suddenly discovered music that sounded heavier than real life. The album climbed the charts, without radio support, without critical praise, without anyone in the music business predicting its success. That should tell you something. Sometimes audiences recognize greatness long before critics do. Let me ask you something. Has there ever been an album that critics hated, but you loved? Music history is full of them. Black Sabbath may be one of the greatest examples. The success of that first album created an unexpected problem. The record company wanted another one. Immediately. There wasn't time to spend a year writing songs. There wasn't time to experiment endlessly in expensive studios. The band went back to work almost as soon as they had finished promoting the first record. That pressure eventually led to one of the greatest accidents in rock history. The band had nearly finished recording their second album. The producer looked around and realized they were a few minutes short. They needed one more song, not another epic, just something to fill the remaining space on the album. Imagine hearing that. You guys need one more song. How many legendary songs have probably never existed because no one asked for one more? Tony started playing a fast guitar riff. Simple, direct, nothing overly complicated. Within minutes, the rest of the band joined him. Geezer quickly wrote lyrics inspired by the anxiety and emotional numbness he saw around him. Ozzy worked out the melody. The whole thing came together incredibly fast. Later, members of the band would remember writing it in well under an hour, with the basic idea coming together in roughly 20 to 30 minutes. The song was called Paranoid. Now ask yourself this. If someone had told the band that this little filler song would become their biggest hit, would they have believed it? Probably not. Sometimes the songs artists spend the least time worrying about become the ones that live forever. Listen to Tony Iommi's opening riff. It's unforgettable. Not because it's technically impossible to play, because it's memorable. That's one of Tony's greatest strengths as a guitarist. He wasn't trying to overwhelm other musicians. He was trying to write riffs that ordinary fans could recognize after hearing them once. That's much harder than it sounds. There are guitar players who can play 1,000 notes a minute. Very few can create a riff the entire world remembers 50 years later. Paranoid is one of those riffs. Then Ozzy enters, finished with My Woman. Immediately, the song feels urgent, restless, almost claustrophobic. Despite the title, Geezer Butler has explained that the lyrics weren't intended as a clinical discussion of paranoia. They reflected depression, isolation, and emotional struggle at a time when very few rock songs spoke openly about those feelings. Remember, this was 1970. Mental health wasn't discussed the way it is today. People were expected to keep those struggles to themselves. Black Sabbath put them directly into a hit record. That's one reason the song continues connecting with new generations. The emotions haven't changed, only the language we use to describe them. Here's another interesting twist. The album wasn't originally supposed to be called Paranoid. The band actually wanted to call it War Pigs, after another song on the record. The record company wasn't enthusiastic. Executives worried the title might limit sales, especially with the Vietnam War dominating headlines. So they chose the title of the shortest song instead. Imagine that decision going the other way. Would we still think of Paranoid as one of the greatest album titles in rock history? Or would millions of people now own an album called War Pigs? Little business decisions sometimes change music history. Now here's a question. Which do you think is Black Sabbath's signature song? Black Sabbath, Iron Man, or Paranoid? There isn't a wrong answer. But Paranoid is probably the song that introduced more people to heavy metal than any other record in history. It became Black Sabbath's only major hit single in many countries. Radio couldn't ignore it. Fans couldn't stop buying it. Even people who had never heard an entire Black Sabbath album knew that riff. That's incredibly rare. The shortest song on the album became the biggest song of the band's career. But while Paranoid made Black Sabbath famous, another song on the same album made them important. And that song almost had a completely different identity. Originally, it wasn't called War Pigs. The working title was Walpurgis. If you've never heard that word before, you're not alone. Walpurgis Night is a centuries-old European tradition, surrounded by folklore involving witches, bonfires, and supernatural legends. Geezer Butler chose the title because it fit the dark atmosphere of the lyrics. But the record company immediately became nervous. The word was unfamiliar. The imagery was controversial. And they worried it would only reinforce the growing belief that Black Sabbath was some kind of a cult band. So before the album was released, the title changed. War Pigs. Honestly, it was a better title. Because once you really listen to the lyrics, you realize this isn't a song about the supernatural at all. It's a song about power, greed, and the people who send others into battle while never facing the consequences themselves. The opening air raid siren tells you immediately, this isn't fantasy anymore. This is reality. The opening air raid siren tells you immediately, this isn't fantasy anymore. This is reality. Listen carefully to the lyrics. Generals gathered in their masses. Geezer Butler wasn't writing about monsters. He was writing about politicians and military leaders. The war pigs weren't soldiers. They were the powerful men making decisions while other people paid the price. That message was especially powerful in 1970. The Vietnam War dominated television every night. Families watched young men leave home. Many never returned. Black Sabbath looked at the world around them and asked a question few rock bands were asking so directly. Who actually profits from war? It's one of the reasons the song still feels relevant today. The names of the conflicts change. The uniforms change. But the questions remain remarkably similar. Now imagine you're a record executive hearing this song for the first time. It's over 7 minutes long. It doesn't have a traditional pop structure. It's openly critical of war. There's no obvious radio edit. Would you release it? Many executives probably would have said no. Fortunately for music history, Black Sabbath rarely worried about writing radio-friendly songs. They wrote the songs they believed in, and audiences rewarded that honesty. One of my favorite moments comes near the end, when the tempo suddenly changes. After several minutes of crushing heaviness, the song bursts into a faster, almost frantic finish. It feels like chaos taking over. That wasn't just clever arranging, it served the story. The music follows the emotion. That's something Black Sabbath became incredibly good at. The riffs weren't there simply because they sounded heavy. They helped tell the story. Now here's another myth worth clearing up. Some people assume heavy metal is simply loud guitars and aggressive singing. But if you strip away the volume and really listen to Black Sabbath, you'll hear something else. Dynamics, space, tension, silence. Tony Iommi knew that a heavy riff becomes even heavier if you give it room to breathe. Sometimes what a band doesn't play is just as important as what they do. Modern metal bands still build entire songs around that philosophy. The influence is everywhere. By this point, Black Sabbath had accomplished something remarkable. They'd created one of the darkest songs ever recorded, one of the biggest rock hits of the 1970s, and one of the greatest anti-war songs in history. Then they wrote what many people consider the greatest guitar riff ever created, Iron Man. Now here's something that surprises a lot of people. The song has absolutely nothing to do with Marvel Comics. The title existed long before the comic book character became a household name. The inspiration actually came from Geezer Butler's imagination after hearing Tony Iommi playing that unforgettable guitar figure. Tony reportedly described the riff as sounding like a giant Iron Man walking toward you. That image stuck. Geezer began imagining a science fiction story. A man travels into the future, sees the end of the world, returns to warn humanity, but is transformed into living steel. People mock him, ignore him, reject him. Eventually, the very person who tried to save humanity becomes the force that destroys it. It's tragic, not triumphant. Now think about that. How many people have been singing along to Iron Man for decades without realizing they're telling a science fiction story? The famous robotic voice announcing, "I am Iron Man," was created by slowing Ozzy's voice through studio processing. Simple by today's standards, innovative in 1970. It immediately tells the listener they're entering another world. Then comes the riff. There are riffs that guitar players admire. Then there are riffs that entire stadiums recognize before the second note is played. This belongs in the second category. Tony Iommi wasn't interested in showing everyone how fast he could play. He wanted riffs that felt inevitable, like they'd always existed, as if someone simply discovered them rather than wrote them. That's an incredibly rare gift. Ask almost any guitarist to name the greatest riffs ever written. You'll almost always hear the same titles: Smoke on the Water, Satisfaction, Sunshine of Your Love, and somewhere near the very top, Iron Man. Now here's something that often gets overlooked. Bill Ward's drumming on this song is extraordinary because he wasn't approaching the music like a traditional hard rock drummer. He came from jazz. Listen closely and you'll hear fills and swing influences that many metal drummers would never think to play. Without Bill Ward, those riffs wouldn't breathe the same way. Heavy metal didn't emerge because one guitarist played loud. It happened because four musicians approached music from completely different backgrounds. Tony brought the riffs, Geezer brought thoughtful lyrics, Bill brought jazz instincts, Ozzy brought personality and vulnerability. Together, they created something no one else could duplicate. Now imagine hearing Iron Man live in 1971. The lights go down, Tony hits that opening riff. The audience knows exactly what's coming. That's the sign of a truly legendary song. Recognition before the lyrics even begin. But success has a strange way of changing bands. The bigger Black Sabbath became, the more pressure surrounded them. Constant touring, constant recording, constant expectations. By the end of the 1970s, the band was exhausted. Drug and alcohol use had become a serious problem for nearly everyone involved. People often tell the story as though Ozzy was the only one struggling. That's not really accurate. Substance abuse affected multiple members of the band. The difference, according to Tony Iommi and others, was consistency. They felt Ozzy had become increasingly unreliable during rehearsals and recording sessions. In 1979, after more than a decade together, Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath. Imagine hearing that news. You're the voice everyone associates with the band. You've helped invent an entire genre, and suddenly, you're out. Most people assumed Ozzy's career was over. Some critics certainly did. The music press questioned whether anyone would hire him. Even Ozzy himself later admitted he was devastated. He spent weeks drinking heavily and wondering if there was any future left. Then one person refused to give up on him: Sharon Arden, later known to the world as Sharon Osbourne. Her father had managed Black Sabbath for years. She believed Ozzy still had something to prove. She encouraged him to stop looking backward and start building something new. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine anyone else managing that comeback. Sharon assembled an extraordinary group of musicians around Ozzy, but one stood out immediately: a young guitarist from California named Randy Rhoads. Randy wasn't trying to sound like Tony Iommi. That would have been impossible. Instead, he brought classical influences, dazzling technique, and a completely different musical vocabulary. Ozzy later admitted that hearing Randy play gave him confidence again. Together they began writing songs for Ozzy's first solo album. One of those songs would become his signature, Crazy Train. The opening guitar harmonics, the unmistakable riff, the energy. It announced something immediately. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't finished. He was beginning a second career. The lyrics reflected the uncertainty of the world around him: Cold War fears, political instability, questions about where humanity was heading. In many ways, it echoed the social concerns Black Sabbath had explored years earlier. Only now the sound was brighter, faster, more melodic. Randy Rhoads changed the direction of heavy guitar playing almost overnight. His blend of classical phrasing, precision, and melody inspired countless guitarists who followed. Unfortunately, his time with Ozzy was heartbreakingly short. In 1982, Randy Rhoads was killed in a tragic plane crash while on tour. He was only 25 years old. Even today, many fans wonder what he might have accomplished had he lived. His influence, however, continues through generations of guitar players who still study his work. And Crazy Train remains one of the defining songs of Ozzy's career. It wasn't just a hit. It was proof that one setback doesn't have to define the rest of your life. Now let's go back to the question we asked at the very beginning. What if Black Sabbath had never existed? Would someone eventually have invented heavy metal? Maybe. History usually finds a way. But would it have sounded like this? Would Metallica have written the same riffs? Would Iron Maiden have built the same style? Would Slayer have existed in the form we know? Would Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pantera, Korn, Slipknot, and countless other bands have followed the same path? It's impossible to know. What we do know is that Black Sabbath gave generations of musicians permission to make music that was darker, heavier, more honest, and less concerned with fitting neatly into what radio expected. That's a legacy very few bands can claim. So now I want to hear from you. Did we choose the right 5 songs? Or would your list include Children of the Grave, NIB, Heaven and Hell, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, or maybe Symptom of the Universe? Drop your top 5 Black Sabbath songs in the comments. I'm willing to bet there are going to be some passionate debates. And honestly, that's exactly what great music should do. It should make us remember. It should make us argue. And every once in a while, it should make us pull an old record off the shelf, drop the needle, and hear it all over again. Until next time, relax, spark one up, and keep that turntable spinning.